Well, hey there, nutrition and wellness students, and welcome to week 5 of the course. We're basically in our last week of the macronutrients, right? Those being carbohydrates, fats or lipids, depending on how you want to call them, fats and oils, and then now protein, the third and final big macronutrient that's in food. Next week, we're going to get into some micronutrients, and then my assumption will be that you understand nutritional labels much better than you did when you did your initial presentation. And if that presentation felt awkward at all, that's part of what I'm trying to do there, is just get you thinking about, like, do I kind of know what any of this is? And then hopefully these few weeks of the course help you to know what some of it is, and you feel like you're learning some stuff, which is my goal here, right? So hopefully that's happening, and hopefully we'll continue. So here we go. Notice I'm asking, did you do the reading first? Hopefully you're used to that by now, and stop this video and go do that reading if you haven't done it yet. Okay, so just like I started the last two videos, we're going to talk about whether these are a monomer-polymer situation or not. And recall that carbohydrates are. They're a monomer, like glucose or fructose, right, or galactose. And then they can make dimers, disaccharides, and they can make polymers, polysaccharides, when you string them together. And fats, I emphasized to you in last week's lesson, are not a monomer-polymer thing. They are fatty acids and glycerol. They make these things triglycerides, and you kind of mix and match the fatty acids. Saturated, unsaturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, omega-3, omega-9, whatever the case may be, right? But those are not polymers, fats. Proteins do make polymers, and they make polymers out of their monomer, which are amino acids. Now, they're called amino acids because some of you who are chemistry fans might, I know that you're out there, some of you might recognize this group as an amine group, and this is what's called a carboxylic acid group. So it's literally just telling you each one of them has two parts on, the edges of it, called an amine group and an acid group, basically. So we call them amino acids. Now, in the middle is a part that is variable, and there's no chemical element R, so we just use R to talk about the variable part of it. So each amino acid has a unique, what we say is R group. You might have learned about these in biology, depending on how much detail you went into. So here, this R prime just signifies that this is a different chemical group hanging off here that makes this a different amino acid. So all of them have the same amine and acid, and then hanging off in between, they have a variable part that makes them different from each other. As we'll see, there are 20 different ones, and they get linked together when one acid group links to the amine group of the next amino acid in the chain. So you can just keep popping them together, thousands and thousands of them if you want to, until you make a big giant chain of amino acids called a protein, right? Now, I want to emphasize something about these amino acids in particular, and that is that their amine group contains nitrogen. So if you don't love this chemistry stuff, that's okay. I hope that you might get to love it a little bit more and see why it's significant through this course, right? But fundamentally, what I want to try to focus on is not throwing, functional group names at you like amine and carboxylic acid, and more talking about practical stuff. Remember, I talked to you in the first week about FONC, life being made. When I talked about what is food, I said basically it's made of PHONC, right? And so far, the molecules we've been studying, carbohydrates, which are C, H, and O, lipids, which are C and H, those molecules have been made using only C, H, and O. So the nitrogen and the phosphorus have been notably absent, okay? And what's interesting is plants, as I mentioned to you at the time, can get carbon and hydrogen and oxygen through photosynthesis, as long as the sun is shining and they are in the air and they have water in their tissues that they've brought up out of the ground, or if they're living in water, even easier, right? So plants can typically make carbs and fats without too much trouble at all. What you'll notice is that plants have a harder time making proteins because proteins contain nitrogen, and they have to get nitrogen from the soil, pretty much. So as a result of that, this is a little bit of a different food item, if you will. Fats and carbs, we might often be thinking about like oh man, you could easily overdo it on those, right? You can eat a lot of a food and just get a lot of carbs and a lot of fats. We don't often hear people worrying about overdoing it on proteins. Um, you know, unpacking a bit about nitrogen here. And so this is also summarizing some of what I've just said. There's this quotation that I put on here. This is actually a paraphrase of what one of my professors in graduate school told us that I just really, it stuck with me and I thought it was a really cool thing. And his opinion was that you could kind of boil all of like eating and competing over resources, all the ecology of the earth. You could boil it all down in a basic sense to it's a competition for nitrogen. Like it's not hard to get carbon or hydrogen or oxygen. Phosphorus can be tough, but nitrogen in particular is just this material that organisms need a ton of to build all their proteins, right? And they just can never really seem to get enough for the most part. The other irony here is that nitrogen is the #1 gas in the air, but it's just not very useful in that form. So as I mentioned to you in the what is food lesson, nitrogen from the air has to be brought in by organisms that can actually pull it out of the air and turn it into something that can be used to make the building blocks of protein. Or it can be brought out of the air by humans when we burn a bunch of fuel in a fertilizer factory and heat up the air so much and put it under such high pressure that it, boom, reacts and makes this fertilizer stuff that is basically, again, nitrogen that can be popped right on and make an amino acid. Consider that ammonia is a common form of nitrogen fertilizer, and ammonia is NH3. You can imagine looking at this structure, how NH3 could be used to make this. You just basically pop an H off and stick it to the C. And there's NH2 stuck to the C. So that's the idea when you're giving plants fertilizer. That's what they're doing. They're using that nitrogen-based fertilizer to make amino acids so that they can make proteins, okay? Now, let's think a little bit then about let's think about fertilizer and a classic fertilizer needy plant, okay, being corn. And I think you're maybe familiar with the fact that corn is a huge staple of American agriculture. We grow more corn than anything else. And the corn that we grow is not just used to, serve corn on the cob at a barbecue. So let's talk about how we produce it and what we do with it and what that says about the nutrition of it, perhaps as well. So corn is super nitrogen needy. It's very nitrogen intensive is another way to put it. And what that means is it needs a lot of nitrogen in order to grow. And it doesn't have a great way of getting it necessarily. So if you grow corn, you need to dump a lot of nitrogen onto your corn. You need to dump a lot of fertilizer on there. Now you might be wondering, well, then how did corn ever grow? We'll answer that question in a minute. So that's a great question if you have it. Like, what if before there were humans, how did it grow? Part of the answer is that we grow like a mutant, gigantic version of it. If you've ever seen the types of corn that are, like multiple different colors, kind of purple and yellow and more traditional corn, they're always smaller. And the kernels are often smaller as well, and they look a little less appetizing. This is a bred version of corn. It's just one variant of corn, but we grow that variant everywhere. And one thing you'll note about food is that people like to go to the grocery store and kind of look at the shelf and have a predictable appearance to their items. They're not going to buy it if they're like, that looks weird. And if you're nodding your head like, yeah, I guess that's true. So there you go, right? So that's part of why, but we'll unpack more about how corn could grow under natural circumstances without this input. At any rate, if we're going to grow a gigantic amount of corn with gigantic kernels and really big ears of corn, then we're going to need to dump a bunch of nitrogen onto that field. That way the corn can have enough protein to grow as fast as it does and to make these gigantic fruits, right? Now, when we harvest those fruits, we might sell them as corn. But the reality is that the majority of it is probably going to be either processed to make, say, corn oil. Omega-6 fatty acids, anybody? Right? This is a major source of it. Now, omega-6 is an unsaturated fatty acid, recall, so it's not a bad thing necessarily. And you'll even note here they're advertising this as heart healthy, which I think is a little disingenuous, but fair enough. It's not saturated fat, it's not trans fat, so it's certainly better than those. The issue is that as Americans, we get a lot of corn in our diets. We get a lot of corn oil in our diet. We get a lot of omega-6s in our diet. We tend to be a little oversaturated, no pun intended, that's a fat pun, a little oversaturated with corn oil type oils like omega-6 oils, and less with omega-3s, like the kind you'd find in flax or in fish oil, salmon. So, a little disingenuous, but at any rate, not necessarily a radically unhealthful product if it's consumed in moderation. Famously, probably, I'm sure you've heard of high fructose corn syrup that is used to flavor sodas. That is also just, you take the corn and you process it and you chemically treat it to break the starch down that's in the corn. You break the starch down into a syrup, so you break it all the way down into monomers. And as you know, the monomers of starch is a polysaccharide. That makes it a carbohydrate. The monomers of that are monosaccharides. Glucose and fructose is what you get. And those are very sweet tasting. And they're, they have a very high glycemic index, right? Pure glucose really is like the highest that there is. So high fructose corn syrup is about half glucose, about half fructose. It's a real dose of immediately absorbed sugars. And that is why if you consume something that has a lot of high fructose corn syrup in it, it'll probably be written as added sugars, and it's going to have a really high spike to your blood sugar that is probably not the healthiest option for you. That said, sugar that is immediately absorbable is generally like that. Like, it's not as though switching to cane sugar or agave nectar. These things are all pretty much sucrose, which is a disaccharide, which is easily broken down and absorbed, or they are, glucose and fructose mixes that are easily absorbed. So if you're eating a lot of sugar in any of those forms, it's just going to be a lot of sugar, right? And probably it's better to avoid overdoing that. But at any rate, that's another thing that we tend to do with corn, right? And many of you noticed on your nutrient labels that there are some weird names of ingredients there, like guar gum or xanthan gum, or these like different materials that you'll find in foods. In many cases, if you see things that have weird names on them, it's not in every case, but a lot of those weird materials, if you just drop them into a Google search and hit enter, you'll likely find out that they're made from corn. So we grow such a massive quantity of this product that we just basically process it into all kinds of stuff. So if you look at a label on your food item, like say like a snack bar that you have, you might see all these names that you're like, what the heck is all this stuff? If they were being honest, they could basically just be like processed corn, processed corn, processed corn, processed corn, processed corn, processed corn. And this is a big part of why a lot of what we actually eat is produced in this way. It's either, it doesn't have to be corn on the cob or corn in a can. It can be corn in a soda or corn oil in something fried that we're eating, or those crazy labeled ingredients that we don't know that they're corn, but they are. And now you know. Now, let's also consider that you can take corn, and this is kind of what's often done with it. You can feed it to animals, including, say, cattle on a concentrated feeding operation. And that has all kinds of environmental effects that we're not really going to talk about here because it's not what this course is about. But it is worth considering that it basically just fattens the cows up like crazy. If you eat a lot of sugar, your body will convert it to fat, right? And so if they're eating a ton of starch here, eating a ton of carbs, what their body will do is break that starch down to sugars and convert that starch to fat, and you'll get nice fattened up cows. Now, of course, they're not the most healthful cows because you might be aware that cows eat, well, not exactly corn usually. And so it's worth asking whether the meat has the same healthful qualities. In addition to the fact that it's extra fatty, it may be reduced in some other micronutrient content, right? And we'll think more about that next week. So I'm trying here to reference back to things you've already heard about. If I'm pushing you a little bit, that's good because I'm trying to push your learning, right? So these cows are consuming corn. And that also kind of means if you eat a steak, you're in a certain way kind of eating corn that was transformed into a steak by an animal, which is kind of weird to think about. Now, corn also happens to be a grass. It's not grass that you grow on your lawn, obviously, unless you're really like you have like a cornfield in your yard, which would be awesome. But yeah, it's usually not grown as a lawn. And the fact that it is a relative of the grass that you'd grow on your lawn is kind of what makes it possible to do this. Still, it's really not the normal diet. Now, finally, there's like the possibility you can just go ahead and take corn and you can turn it into biofuels. So if you pump gas into your car, part of what's in that gas is ethanol, and the ethanol is actually made from corn. So we don't just process it into oil directly and indirectly into like chemically modified products, and maybe even more indirectly into like a steak. We also process it into the stuff in your gasoline in your car. So corn is really everywhere, and it's all about that nitrogen input. If you can give corn enough nitrogen, it will grow because it'll be able to make enough protein. Then you can process it into different substances. Now, worth noting, though, that high fructose corn syrup and corn oil do not have protein in them. So the protein's been removed to the extent that it was there. Cows, of course, would be a great source of protein. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And I hope you don't consider this a source of anything other than movement for your vehicle. But at any rate, it's worth noting that the protein doesn't necessarily stay in, but the nitrogen feed is what makes this possible. Okay, so let's talk about like a little bit of a different maneuver. And you may have heard of this before, what's called Three Sisters agriculture. This was practiced by Native people in the Americas. And this is how corn was really grown back before there was nitrogen-based fertilizers. What you would do is grow it with legumes, beans, basically. Beans can do this reaction because they have bacteria that live in their root systems. They can do this reaction that pulls nitrogen out of the air and allows amino acids to be produced so that proteins can be synthesized. And you notice that right here on this image. This is a really great image, so I encourage you to pause the video and take a look at it if you'd like. Addition to the beans, right, you can also grow squash, which does all kinds of other cool things you can read about, like it shades the ground to keep weeds from growing up, and it is thorny, so it kind of keeps like things that might try to come along and eat your corn plant, pest species might be kept away by that. And all three of these yield food. So pretty cool that this interaction is all about nitrogen. It's all about protein. So I want you to be seeing protein is this thing that's like hard to get. And a lot of interactions, whether it's in industrial agriculture or if it's in traditional agriculture, the means of growing things are basically planned around nitrogen flows, perhaps as much as anything. So it's worth you knowing that. It's all about making sure that the protein is there. But you might be saying, well, okay, fine, all right, cool. This is how protein gets made, but you're not really talking about protein in my diet. Fair enough. Let's talk about that to finish off this presentation. So the key thing to know about proteins in your diet is you need a bunch of them because you're an animal and you're made out of a lot more protein than a plant is. Plants build a lot of their structure out of carbohydrates. Remember that wood is actually it's a polysaccharide. It's a carbohydrate polymer. So a lot of plant structure is made out of carbohydrates. A lot of your structure is made out of protein, actually. So you need a good bit of this stuff. So you got to kind of keep eating and getting amino acids to make proteins out of. However, right, as long as you are eating the red ones here, theoretically, you could make these other ones. Now, you don't need to memorize any of these structures, of course, but there's no way for me to talk about this without saying, here are the names of the ones. They have crazy sounding names. If you learn biology and organic chemistry, you'll understand why they're called what they're called. I encourage you to do that in your life. It's worth it. But these 9, right, are the 9 that you cannot make in your cells. If you don't eat them, you'll start to run out of them. And if you start to run out of them, you run into a very bad health outcome. Your hair gets extra thin because your hair is made of protein. You start having amino acids you can't like use lying around because you're limited in these other 9. So some of these other 11 might just be lying around, and it actually causes like osmosis to make water move into your tissues and makes you swell, called edema, right? So there's all these really nasty side effects to being deficient in the essential amino acids. So the crucial thing to planning protein intake is to plan sufficient protein intake, right? Which is based on, of course, like body mass as well as level of activity. And if you're an elite athlete, of course, you're focused on getting enough protein. And if you're, maybe like a teacher who's not quite an elite athlete, maybe I'm a little bit less focused, but still thinking about this. And you especially want to make sure you're getting a balanced amount of protein to make sure you're getting all of these essential amino acids. You might wonder what conditionally non-essential means. It basically means typically you can make these, but there are some times when ill health can cause you to be unable to make these. So there are some conditions you can find yourself in health-wise where these can become essential. These ones are never essential. You can always make these as long as you are living. So let's talk a bit about like, what does a healthful approach to consuming protein look like? I think a lot of people, like I kind of Google searched for like sources of protein in food, like food with high protein content or something like that, and just did an image search. And the top image is the first thing that came up. And it's like, yeah, of course, it's, it's animal products. Like there's chicken and there's beef and there's pork and there's fish and there's like sausages and cheese and eggs. And these are all things that are rich in protein. Now, I just mentioned to you, animals make ourselves out of a lot of protein, like much more so than plants in general. So that means that animals are tend to be like higher protein when we eat them, right? And I think we're all kind of aware that animals and animal products are high in protein. That said, don't sleep on the fact that like if you're eating cheese, there's also a good bit of fat in there. And so you might ask questions about like, okay, what kinds of fats might be found in there? It's probably a lot of saturated fat because it's animal fat. So maybe I want to be a little careful about not having too crazy much of that. But note that it's a good source of protein, right? Now, that said, in addition to the image in the top there, in the bottom left, right, you notice there's a different array of foods laid out, and this includes some grains and some nuts and things like this. There's like almonds and like walnuts and I think I see like a kind of a bean mix in the middle. Beans are a legume, so they are very good at making protein because they have those bacteria in their roots that help them to do it. Yeah, and some other like wild rice down in the bottom there. So there are plants that actually can acquire a decent bit of nitrogen and make a good bit of protein. And I'll note that if you eat a varied diet of foods like nuts and grains, especially like, whole grains, not processed grains like white rice, but instead like whole grains that contain, going back to our carbs presentation, they contain that like germ that has got those nutrients in it. That tends to have a lot of the protein. So consuming whole grains, nuts, in addition to meat in moderation so that you don't go over on, perhaps like saturated fat intake or something like that. Though, again, I don't want to over encourage, like you don't need to cut all meat out of your diet or something unless that's something that you plan to do, right? Meat is healthful as long as it's not over consumed. But a balance is the key here. So this is the thing I kind of want to leave you with, is you'd want to be able to name plant products, and you can see a bunch of examples. So write down some of your favorites here. If you love avocado, like I love avocado, I think a lot of people would agree with me. Wonderful to know that it's rich in protein. If you really love cashews, I do too. If you like wild rice, delicious. If you like cheese, if you like fish, right? And you might even notice now some foods are coming up multiple times. Like, oh yeah, those wild rice grains would be like the whole grain of the rice, since they would also have a lot of cellulose, and that's fiber, and that's good for you. In addition to like a lot of micronutrients in the germ, which is good for you. In addition to a decent bit of protein. And again, since we have to get a variety of amino acids in our diet, because there's this list and there's 9 of them that we need to make sure we're getting enough of every day, the best thing you can do is to mix up your sources, right? Some nuts, some fish, some terrestrial animals, some broccoli, some avocado, some egg, some cheese, some beans. If you mix those things up, you're pretty much guaranteeing that you'll be acquiring enough protein and you'll be requiring enough of the essential amino acids that you'll have a nutritive and healthful protein intake in your diet. So I hope that's interesting to you. I hope you can begin to see how this journey that we're on is pulling together information that now helps you to think about a given food. You're like, salmon, let's talk about salmon. They've got omega-3s. They've also got a lot of protein. If you have wild caught salmon, it would be, not as full of saturated fat and more healthful for that reason. So wild caught salmon, let's go, right? So again, I'm hoping that you're looking at these things and seeing not just 1 week's lesson, but all of the lessons so far. In the discussion this week, I'm asking you to post 3 things, basically a response to something about carbs, a response to something about lipids, a response to something about proteins, and then the 4th response I'm asking you to do, and I hope it'll be fun for you. I encourage you to get into this. I want you to go back and look at the presentation that you made on your nutritional label, the 3 nutritional labels that you looked at. And I want you to kind of start with the question, what have you learned since then? Do you know more about what's going on with those 3 foods? You could pick one, or you could talk about all 3, or you could talk about 2 out of 3, whatever you want. A lot of you seemed kind of like, yeah, I don't really know. Like, this is something, I don't know. This is a word I can read, but I'm not 100% sure whether it's good for me or bad for me, or like what I would say about it. And I'm hoping that there are some of those things you could now unpack in greater detail. And I want us to share that with each other in our first really content-driven discussion. I hope that gets us all excited. Like, hey, I actually learned a bunch of stuff about, these different molecules and the way that they alter the nutritive qualities of the food that I eat. And since I picked 3 foods that I have on hand, I might snack on, I might have cultural meaning surrounding, that I might have at like a holiday or whatever. Since you've done that, it gives us a chance to share a bit of that with each other, and also to walk away with some really applicable knowledge. So next time you see those, you're really thinking, man, I know what that's made of, and I know the things that are beneficial there, and I also know the things to watch out for. So I hope you enjoyed that discussion. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. For this week's work, that's all that there is just making sure that you complete the quiz, which is on this material, in the reading and in this video, and then completing the discussion with those 4 posts plus 1 reply to a classmate. Thanks, everybody.